Thank you, Whit, for that great introduction. So thank you for being here today. To even say that it's really important to be here, to be listening to stuff about science when we don't know what's going to be happening for the next 4 years. So thank you for being here. Yeah, so I'm going to start out by giving you a little bit of an introduction to humpback whales. Humpback whales are a baleen whale or a mysticete, and what that means is they have these big plates of keratin that look like brushes. It's made of the same material as our hair and our fingernails, and they use this to strain the water for their food, which includes small fishes like herring, sardines, as well as shrimp like krill. Humpback whales grow up to about 18 meters and 40 tons. The females tend to get larger than the males. And just to give you an idea of scale, the humpback whales, they're in the middle. The blue whale is the largest mammal to exist. And then we have the elephant at the bottom, which is the largest land mammal. So just to give you an idea of scale. In addition, humpback whales are a cosmopolitan species, so they're present worldwide. So here's just a map of the distribution of species. There are several different populations. Late last year, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, divided them up into 14 distinct population segments. 4 are still listed as endangered, 1 is threatened, and then the Hawaiian population is listed as, or is not listed, so it's no longer on the Endangered Species Act. And during the summertime, in both hemispheres, the humpback whales move into the higher latitudes, so into colder waters, which are more nutrient-rich in order to feed. During the winter months, when it's cooler, they move into warmer waters at lower latitudes. So in these areas, they breed, they don't tend to feed, except for the one Arabian Sea population. All the rest of the populations migrate to the warmer waters to breed, raise their calves for a few months. I am going to be focusing on the Hawaii population, the Hawaii breeding grounds, and the whales that move up to Alaska to feed and come back down here to Hawaii, to breed. They make this annual migration of 3,000 miles each way and a little over a month. Just as a point of interest, the longest recorded migration was a gray whale that traveled from off the Russian coast down to the Mexican, the waters off Mexico, and that was over 14,000 miles. So why do we want to use acoustics to study whales? Sound travels about 5 times faster in water than air, and it also travels further than light underwater. So this way you can sample larger areas. It's a very good way to monitor remote areas, so areas that you can't access easily. You also get 24/7 coverage. So if you think about it, all these animals are underwater. You can't see them unless you're underwater. And then at night when it's dark, it's really hard to observe them. So if we can record sounds 24 hours a day, then we can at least get an idea of their presence and sometimes, depending on what sounds they make, what they're doing underwater. You can also limit the disturbance to animals. For certain studies, we follow the animals around to observe them, and just our presence, just being there, could be enough to disrupt their natural patterns. So putting a recorder down at the bottom of the ocean is less likely to disturb the animals in the area because you drop it and then you no longer have a presence. It's just an object sitting on the bottom of the ocean. So this is a way we can look at the behavioral ecology of animals. So how are animals utilizing and interacting with their environment, and in this case, acoustically. So I'll talk a little bit about humpback whale acoustics first. One of the types of sounds that I'll be talking about are social sounds, and I'll be referring to those as calls. These are made by both males and females of all ages. They can be heard on breeding grounds, feeding grounds, and migration routes. And they can be heard in many different contexts. So you can see the picture at the bottom. This is a group of humpback whales doing some bubble net feeding. And there's a feeding call that's associated with this activity. We're pretty sure there are also contact calls, so especially between mothers and calves, we know that there are contact calls in other species, so they can keep track of each other. And we also pick up sounds in competitive groups where there are multiple males competing for access to a female. The other, probably more famous sound is the humpback whale song. So most people, if you think of humpback whales or just whale sounds, are thinking of humpback whale songs. Since it was first described by Payne and McVeigh in 1971, it's probably been the most studied whale sounds out there. We have only recorded it from males, and they tend to sing in this stereotypical head-down position, about 30 to 45 degrees off of the vertical. And we're not sure why, and they're usually stationary. Songs are usually heard on the breeding grounds, but they can also be picked up on the migration routes and also on the feeding grounds at the beginning and end of the breeding season. So songs are a highly structured series of sounds. Those sounds I'm going to refer to as units or song units. And the function is still unknown. So despite being studied for over 50 years, we still don't know exactly why the males sing. We assume it has something to do with breeding, but we don't know if it's to attract females, to repel males, to mark out some sort of territory. Nothing's been proven yet. One other thing I'll be talking about is chorusing. Chorusing is just the simultaneous asynchronous song that's going on, kind of the overall sounds that all these males together are putting out in the ocean. So it's kind of a background din of humpback whale song. So just to give you an idea, this is a spectrogram. What you see is on the x-axis is time, on the y-axis is frequency, and this is just a representation of humpback whale song. So at the top, hopefully you can see several units are marked out. So 1 unit is the shortest continuous sound that is in a song. Several of these units together will form a phrase. These phrases can be repeated, so that's what you see at the very top line. And then several of these phrases together can form a theme, and then this song is made out of 3 themes. You can then have songs that repeat over and over for a song session, and humpback whales can then sing for hours at a time. But generally, one song is about 15 minutes or so. Okay, so before I really dive in, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on acoustics, so some of the terms I will be using. So here's another spectrogram. The color scale is different, but the idea is the same. So first of all, we have time on the x-axis, and then we have frequency on the y-axis. And when I say frequency, I'll be talking about basically the pitch of the sound. So if you have something that's really high frequency, that's what it's going to sound like. And something really low frequency is going to be a lower pitch. And it's calculated or measured in hertz or kilohertz. We also have things like fundamental frequency and harmonics. So fundamental frequency is the lowest frequency. So you can see the yellow at the bottom. Those are going to be the fundamental frequencies for these units. And then the harmonics then are those lines that you see on top. They're multiples of that fundamental frequency. When I talk about sounds that we pick up, I'll be talking about how loud it is. And that is sound pressure level. And sound pressure level is measured in decibels, or dB. For human hearing, which is what most of acoustics is based off of, we hear 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, and then when we say 0 dB, we reference it to 20 micropascals. So That's basically our threshold of human hearing. But when we talk about sounds underwater, we have a reference pressure of 1 micropascal. So we have a different ratio that we're using to calculate sound levels. Just so you get an idea, later when I'm talking about sound pressure levels, you can't directly relate it to any numbers you know of for your own hearing. However, decibels are a logarithmic scale, and so when I talk about a difference of, for example, 6 dBs, that's double the amount of sound. So just to give you an idea, like 6 dBs doesn't sound like much, but it's actually a lot of extra sound that you're exposed to. And then RMS stands for root mean squared. When I calculate sound levels, there are several different ways to calculate it. For humpback whale sounds, root mean squared is the most relevant metric, I guess, or relevant way of calculating the sound pressure. So all of my sound pressure levels will be in terms of RMS. Okay, so why do we care about all this? Well, we know a lot about humpback whales already, but we still have a lot of unanswered questions, especially about the range of acoustic behaviors that they produce. And my overarching question for my dissertation was, what can we learn about the acoustic environment of humpback whales while they're here in Hawaii? So going to my first chapter, we wondered, what is the chorusing behavior like of humpback whales around the island of Hawaii? My first objective was to determine if there are any seasonal patterns or what the seasonal pattern is for chorusing. And then we wanted to determine if there were any diel patterns chorusing. So is there a daily pattern? Are they louder during the day or night? Is there any kind of trend or pattern there? And then my third objective was to determine if there's a spatial pattern around the island. So do they tend to like using one side of the island more than the other? And we did this by recording sounds on an autonomous recorder called an ear, or ecological acoustic recorder. And that's what you see in the picture at the bottom. On the very left of the side of the picture, there's a concrete block. That's what we use to weigh the recorder to the bottom. The yellow part there is an acoustic release. That's how we can get the instrument to come back up to the surface from the bottom. And then the big orange part is the float. Inside the float is the ear itself. That includes the batteries, a hard drive, and a processor so that we can program it to record on a duty cycle. And at the very top, we've got the flag, and the hydrophone is at the top of the little package above the float. So for this study, we record ears at 5 different locations around Hawaii. You can see them labeled as north, northwest, northeast, southwest, and southeast locations. Each of them were deployed at about the 600 to 700 meter contour, except for one. For location north, it was out at 400 meters depth because the slope didn't drop off as quickly. And because we were aiming for that 600 to 700 meter contour, this distance to shore varies. They go from about 5 to 14 kilometers offshore. Okay, so we put out these recorders for 5 non-continuous deployments for approximately 2 years. And files were recorded for 30 seconds every 5 minutes, so they're on a duty cycle. It's not constantly recording. We had over 560,000 files to look at. And the recorders record at 2 different sampling rates, 64 and 80 kilohertz. Because I was interested in looking at humpback whale sounds only, the recordings were decimated or downsampled to a 4 kilohertz sample rate. What does that mean? It means the original recordings look like this. It covers a wide range of frequencies, and I'm only interested in the bottom slice. Once I decimate, then I'm only looking at a limited range of frequencies. So this way you can see the humpback whale sounds are a lot more prominent, and I'm getting rid of any higher frequency sounds that I'm not interested in. I then was able to calculate the sound pressure level, or SPL, for each file, and average those over each hour or each day, depending on what scale I was interested in looking at. Okay, for analysis, I used the generalized linear model, which uses a smoother function to fit basically a best fit line to the data. And I was trying to look at the sound pressure level as a function of date and location, and also of hour and location, depending on which scale I was looking at again. I also ran an ANOVA to look at humpback whale season, which was designated January through April versus non-season periods of the year, and then to look at, during the humpback whale season, day versus night differences. And I was interested in the trends across these different time scales, but I also wanted to take into account location, because as you saw, the ears were deployed all around the island of Kauai. We don't know if there's a difference in how they use the area, so location was a factor in all these calculations. So what did I find? Well, first of all, I omitted January, October, November, and December because of lack of data. But for the rest of the year, you can kind of see the trends here. Found that the daily average sound pressure level was predicted by the date, and was also significantly different for each location. The smoothers were all significant and explain 70% of the variation. And you can see the smoothers are those lines that are kind of running through the middle of all the data points, and then the gray shaded area is the standard error. So overall, we found there was a higher sound pressure levels during this humpback whale season, which are here, and it was lower during the summers or non-season. And there was an average of 6 decibel increase during the humpback season, so when they're around. So again, that's a doubling in sound that's in the water during those periods of time. I did also want to point out for northeast and southeast, you might see that there are kind of a period with higher levels and a period with lower levels. Those are differences between the two different years, and we're still looking at possible environmental factors that are contributing to this difference. So on the left here, this is the difference between humpback whale season and non-season sound levels for all locations. We found that for these representative months of March and August that I substitute in order to avoid those transition periods, there was a significant difference between season and non-season sound levels. And then on the right here, we have SPL for each of the locations, looking at combining the season and non-season values. So those were also found to be significantly different from each other. And this is kind of the combined results of the two. So interactions, we have season sound pressure levels in blue and non-season sound pressure levels in red. And then you can see for each location, they're slightly different from each other. So all around Kauai, overall, it's louder during the humpback season. If you think about it, pretty much anywhere in Kauai, if you go out there when the whales are here and stick your head underwater, you're likely to hear them singing out there. I did also do a post hoc Tukey's test to look at each location and season to see if they're different from each other. I was mostly interested in within each location if they're different from each other, and they were significantly different from each other. Sorry, for season versus non-season. Okay, and then looking at just during the humpback whale season, so I looked at only February and March, so as again to avoid those transition months, and going to examine the change across hours while the whales are here. So the sound pressure level was predicted by the hour of day and was again significantly different by location. The GAM smoothers explained 31% of the variation for this test. And then we saw higher sound pressure levels. Sorry. Okay, so the shaded boxes are the night hours and the non-shaded areas are the day hours. We found that there was higher sound pressure levels during the day at all locations except for southeast. There was about a 1 dB difference at north, northeast, and northwest locations, and a 3 dB difference at the southwest location. So similar to before, I was looking at day versus night differences for all the locations, and there's that approximately 1 dB difference during the day, and it was significantly different. And then on the right here, you have the sound pressure levels, 24 hours of the day, for all season, or during the humpback whale season. The Manoa again found significant differences between locations. And this is similar to before, the interaction. So we have day in red and night in blue. And you can see again that each of the locations are different from each other and then the day versus night are also different except for at southeast. So for southeast, the average or the mean was actually higher at night than during the day. So we find out from this study, we wanted to determine what the temporal pattern was for chorusing. We found that there is a mean of a 6 dB increase during humpback whale season compared to non-season. So humpback whale song is a major contributor to the soundscape during winter. And soundscape is a term we use to just explain a holistic way of examining sounds in the ocean, so all the sounds that are out there. Then we wanted to determine if there were any diel patterns for chorusing. We found that in general, there's a slight increase of 1 decibel during the day compared to night. The southeast location was the only one that did not have this increase. It's not consistent with the findings of Al et al. 2000. In this study, there was 1 reporter placed offshore of Maui, about 1 kilometer offshore, and in 13 meters depth. So it's much shallower and much closer to shore compared to the reporters we had in this study off of Hawaii. But for the Maui study, we found that the sound pressure levels were about 4 dB louder at night than during the day. So why is that? Well, it could be the whales are moving around. They could be coming in shallower at night, moving offshore during the day. It could be that they're just deciding to sing differently at different locations. Maybe the whales off Hawaii decide to sing louder during the day, and maybe the whales off Maui decide to sing louder at night. We don't really know. But there was someone, Olaf Vogel was doing some infrared work off of the southern side of Hawaii, and they were able to observe whales closer to shore at night than during the day. So that seems to support the idea that whales are moving closer to shore at night and then moving offshore during the day. And then last, I wanted to determine if there's a spatial pattern around Hawaii. We found that during the humpback whale season, the sound pressure levels were higher around the northern locations. So it's likely there were more whales on the northern sides of the islands compared to the southern sides. The southwest location had the lowest sound pressure levels overall. And why is that? Well, it could be effects of human presence. So along the south shore of Kauai, we have several harbors. North side is subject to stronger swells, wind. It's rougher conditions overall, so there's less of human presence on the north side. In addition, also for the southwest location, that's close to the Pacific Missile Range Facility, and that's a military area, so there's some restricted access to that area. So that could be why there's overall lower sound pressure levels if there are less boats as well contributing to the sound levels. In addition, especially for the eastern side, we thought there might be a possible effect from the SOFAR channel. So the SOFAR channel is the sound fixing and ranging channel. It's an area where there's slower sound speeds, and that makes this channel where the sound just kind of stays in there and doesn't really go out. So you can be picking up sounds from much further away when you're within this channel. And we're not sure, but we're trying to take a look at the data and see if for those years in the southeast and northeast locations, if maybe one year the ears had been deployed in the SOFAR channel maybe are picking up different sounds compared to other years and other locations. So this chapter kind of tells us a little about the large-scale patterns of humpback whales using the habitat in Hawaii. And next, we'll talk a little bit about songs and using that to inform us about population structure. So we know that humpback whale songs evolve. They're generally about the same within a breeding population and within a year, but they do change over time. So depending on the year, you may start with the same song and end with the same song. And another year, if they've decided they're going to be a little more creative, you might start with one song and end with a different one by the end of the season. It varies by year. The other thing is that within a breeding population, they sing approximately the same song, but at a different breeding population, they might be singing a different song. So the whales in Hawaii will sing about the same thing, but the whales in Hawaii will sing something different from Mexico and different from Japan. And one of the reasons behind this study was that there was a large-scale study of the North Pacific humpback whale population about 10 years ago, and they found that in their surveys there was a group of whales up in Alaska that fed there that weren't well represented in any of the breeding areas. And along with some studies that stated that humpback whales, which hadn't been well represented in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, were spotted up there and could be using the area, we decided to take a look and see if it might be possible that those whales that we aren't seeing anywhere else are going to the northwestern Hawaiian Islands instead of any of the other known breeding locations. Here's a map of the northwestern and main Hawaiian Islands. We again used ecological acoustic recorders, ears. They're placed up at Lusiansky, Morrow, French Frigate Shoals, and then 2 locations off of Oahu, Makapu'u and Makua. And each of these ears was placed at a shallow location at less than 30 meters, except for the Makapu'u ear, which is a little deeper at 150 meters. So this is important because they tend to pick up reef sounds, to pick up the fish and snapping shrimp, and sometimes we pick up surface sounds, so things that sounded like waves or rain. We had ear recordings for 2009 from January through May. They recorded on a duty cycle, so when they were up in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, they recorded once every 15 minutes. We wanted to take advantage of being able to go up there to these remote islands that there are very few ships that go up there, and cover as long a time period as possible. For the ears off of Oahu, the duty cycle was recording every 5 minutes, so we had, because we were able to go out there and refurbish them as needed. Had over 65,000 files, and we ran all these files through a program to see if we could get an idea of which files had humpback whale sounds. So sounds that I was interested in, as opposed to, for example, reef sounds. So then we found that standard deviation happened to be the best predictor for the presence of song. I then looked at a subset of the data to try and get an idea of what song units were being used by the whales that season. I ended up with a list of 21 different units. And then I went through the files and randomly selected files from each location. I went through each file, identified the units that were in there, and counted how many of each unit were present. And then I calculated how often each unit was present at each location. Using that, I could compare between locations the frequency of the occurrence of the units. So here are some of the more common song units that I picked up for 2009. And just remind you that I have time on the x-axis. In this case, I just marked out how long each song unit was, and then frequency is on the y-axis. I'll let you listen. see, there's a wide range of sounds that they're making. And then I was looking at the proportion, so how often do each of these song units occur at each location? For 5 of these common units, you can see some of the patterns. So for L, for example, it decreases from Lisiansky up at the northwest down to Makapu to the southeast. Now in contrast, units B and B increase moving down to the southeast. Now not all units show these patterns, so unit V and unit U don't really show a clear pattern. But looking at the total, all of the units, about 1/3 of them show some sort of gradient like this. So I ran a cluster analysis, and because this seemed to be the best way, since some of the units were very seldom heard and had low frequencies of occurrence. The cluster analysis was able to group the 2 main Hawaiian Island locations together. We would expect that since they're on either side of the same island, and we know that they do travel, the whales do travel around the island. And then the 3 northwestern locations grouped together. So Morrow and Lisiansky up to the northwest were the most similar, followed by French frigate shoals. So we wanted to compare the frequency of song units in the main and northwestern Hawaiian Islands. What we found is that it looks like there might be some kind of geographical gradient as you move along the island's chain. And for some future work, I'd be really curious to know if there's some change over time for this season. So I was limited in by the low sample size of files with good signal to noise ratio. That's why I didn't break it down any further. But it'd be interesting to see if the song unit frequencies at the beginning of the season are different from those at the end for each location. Okay, so now we've talked a little bit about song throughout the population. We're going to move down and examine sound levels on an individual level. So we wanted to determine what sound pressure levels a calf might be receiving from a singing adult nearby. Humpback whale chorusing, as we now know, is a major sound source. And the calves that are born down here in the Hawaiian Islands are being exposed to all this song out there. This is their first exposure to sounds that, at least for the males, they might be producing in a few years. And we're wondering, how much of this are they being exposed to? There's also been concern about anthropogenic or man-made sounds in the ocean. And it's difficult to determine the effects that man-made sounds have on these animals if we don't even know what sounds they're hearing from natural sources in their environment. So we're hoping to kind of give a little bit of context to sound levels out there that these animals are being exposed to. The way we studied this was using an Acoustic tag. This tag has a hydrophone that's recording sounds that can be recording on a duty cycle or consistently, and for us we had it on recording constantly. It also has a pressure transducer so we can estimate depth, as well as 3-axis accelerometers and a compass so that we can track the movements of the animals. And it also has a temperature and light sensor. We were tagging off of Maui, between Maui, Lanai, and Ho'oahe. This is a very popular area for mother calf groups. There are some shallower waters and it's very warm, and it seems to attract the mother calf groups. So to give you an idea of what it looks like to go tagging, this is me tagging along. So you can see it's very exciting when we actually put a tag on an animal. Okay, so this is the tag that I will be talking about. We managed to place it on a calf in March of 2014. There was one calf in a mother calf escort group. So the escort is a male that's following around a mother and calf, usually for, we assume at least for a breeding opportunity. While the tag is on, we're also taking behavioral observations. We have to track the animal and get the tag back in order to get the data. It's not transmitted. It's all stored on the tag. We had a sample rate of 10.1 kilohertz, and that means that I can examine sounds up to 5 kilohertz. So similar to before, I looked at the spectrograms and I listened to it and identified the song units that were recorded on this tag. When I was analyzing it, I excluded song units with excessive flow noise or overlapping vocalization. Since I was interested in the sound pressure levels that the calf was receiving, I didn't want that data to be basically contaminated by other sounds. I wanted to focus on just the song units that the male was producing. So then I calculated the sound pressure level for each unit. To give you an idea of what I was looking at, up at the top here is one section of the tag where the group was stationary. So they weren't moving, just hear the song of the male as it was with the group. Hopefully you can follow along now that you've seen a few spectrograms. And then on the bottom, this is a different section where there's a bit of flow. So the group was traveling slowly, and if you can see at the bottom here, there's a lot more yellow. And that yellow is the sound that's being picked up from water rushing over the tag. I'll try playing it. And then sometimes, the new spectrogram on top, the animals were traveling so quickly that the noise from the flow going over the tag drowns out everything else. So now there's actually a song unit here and a song unit here. You can hear it a little bit over the sound of the rushing water, but it really doesn't make sense to try and measure how much sound is from a unit when there's so much sound from the flow as well. Okay, so the tag was on this calf for 65 minutes. While I was on there, it recorded song from the escort, as well as background chorusing, non-song vocalizations, high flow noise, as you saw, and some boat engine sounds. I extracted 695 song units, and 548 were deemed to have a good signal-to-noise ratio and were used in calculating the sound pressure levels. So I found that at the calf, the tag picked up song units from 126 to 158 dBs with an average or mean of 136 dBs. I also looked at the dive profile for the calf. Dove down to just over 50 meters. Looking at the GPS tracks and the bottom topography, we're pretty sure that the calf just dove right to the bottom where the mom is often resting when they're stationary. So we wanted to know what sound pressure levels a calf is exposed to. We found that range from 126 to 158 dBs. Based on previously reported sound levels that a singer produces, which range from 151 to 173 dBs, this is in a reasonable range. So the way we made this estimate was we know from previous behavioral studies that the calf usually stays close to the mom, and then the escort likes to stay close to the mom. So if the calf has to leave the mom to go up to the surface because it needs to breed more often. So the maximum distance of the calf to the mom is approximately the distance between the surface and the bottom where the mom is resting. From the dive data, we know that it's 50 to 60 meters. And since the escort is assumed to be close to the mom, then the calf would be about 50 to 60 meters away from the singer, the sound source. So doing just kind of a rough calculation of transmission loss, the range of sounds that is received is kind of in the reasonable range for what we would expect. So the singer is not singing any quieter just because it's next to a mom and calf. So in the study, we were looking at sounds received by a calf from a conspecific, so the same species. We don't know if the reactions to anthropogenic noise are going to be the same or different, but this at least gives us an idea of what sound is out there in the ocean, what sounds are the calf being exposed to from its conspecifics. Okay, so we'll move on now and switch from song, which I've been talking about for the past 3 chapters, to social sounds. We don't want to forget this other class of sounds. Social sounds have been studied in fewer areas. It's not as well described. There have been studies in Alaska and New England in the feeding areas. There's been quite a bit of work done actually along Australia's migratory corridor. There's a long-term study recording the sounds of traveling groups as they migrate from Antarctica up to the breeding grounds in the South Pacific. And then more recently, someone's just been studying the social sounds made by groups in the Mexican breeding grounds. However, there are very few studies that focus on mother-calf vocalizations. In fact, I can only think of one that specifically reports the sounds of calves, and that was actually done here in Hawaii. So we assume that calves learn the sounds as they go. I mean, the songs change across years. They have to learn those, right? But what do they start out with? We don't know what sounds they're making when they've just been born, haven't migrated yet. They're still less than a year old and with their mothers. So we wanted to know what are the types of sounds that these mothers and calves are producing when they're on their breeding grounds. Just some basic idea of how often the sounds are being produced and what frequencies are being utilized. And one of the other reasons behind this is we want to know, we have a good idea of what song is like out here, but what are the social sounds like? Are they susceptible to being covered up by all the whale watching boats out there, or the shipping boats? Any of these other anthropogenic sound sources that are so common around the islands. So again, we're using suction cup tags. These were deployed for about a couple weeks each year, between February and March, and throughout 3 years, from 2014 to 2016. Tag recordings were again done concurrently with behavioral observations, and we had to track the tags to get them back. At times we did lose track of where a tag was, and what did we do then? Well, you can see me on the right with this big antenna array. There's a VHF tracker on the tag, and we use this VHF to try and triangulate and find the animals, find the tag, and get it back. Okay, so similar to before, converted the sound files to WAV files so that I could look at it and listen to it. I was able to identify calls, and then for my analysis of frequencies being used by these animals, I omitted any calls that were obscured by flow noise, obscured by overlapping calls. So for example, if I had a singer and they made a social sound and those 2 calls are overlapping, I would omit those from my calculations. And then any sounds that were repeated in a song pattern. So some social sounds in other locations are reported to be single song units, but they're considered social sounds because they aren't repeated. They're just a single sound used in a social context. So that's why it was very important for me to make sure that any of these calls that I thought were a social sound was not being repeated in a song pattern. I used an ANOVA to test if the tagged animal, which could be a mother or a calf, or the group type, which could be a mother-calf group or a mother-calf with escort group, influence the calling rate. And then I described the calls by the frequency and the duration. So over those 3 years, I placed 10 tags on animals for over 44 hours of recordings. I found that there were calling rates from 0 to 16 calls per hour. There was no significant difference between mother and calf tags, although I did find that there were almost 5 calls per hour more on the calf tags than on mom tags. I found a similar result for group type. There were almost 5 calls more in mother-calf escort groups than in mother-calf groups, but it was statistically insignificant. I also found that the calls tend to occur in something like bouts, so you have either one call or a series of calls, followed by a long period of silence before you get another call or series of calls. So if we're looking at the calls themselves, I identified 12 different call types. There are 381 calls and 298 were used in calculations. The most common were upsweep calls and pulsed calls. That's just my name for it. And they're very quiet. I'm going to try and play these. So here's the first upsweep, upsweep 1. It's very short. And then upsweep 2. And then this pulse call with 2 pulses. It kind of sounds like a hiccup. What we found is that for these social calls, most of them are less than 1 second. There were only 2 call types that on average were longer than 1 second. And if you remember back to the song units, those all tend to be 1 second or longer, up to 3 seconds. So there's a difference in duration of each call. And then the most common frequencies for these social sounds were from 30 hertz to 400 hertz. So they're fairly low frequencies, although occasionally some of the calls got up to 2.5 kilohertz. Okay, so what do we find out about social calls of these animals? Found that calls tend to occur in bouts, and they're relatively infrequent. And primarily low frequencies are being used. So what does this mean? Well, it's just the beginning of the studies on these mother-calf vocalizations. I still have a lot of work I want to do for these. In addition, I've only put out 10 tags on 10 different groups, and it would be really great to be able to deploy more so we can make sure we have covered the full range of vocalizations made by these mother-calf groups. Okay, so what did we learn about acoustic environment of humpback whales in Hawaii overall? Well, we found that chorusing adds a significant amount of sound to the environment while the humpback whales are here. Chorusing is generally louder during the day, at least around Hawaii. There appears to be a gradient in the song unit frequencies going from the main to the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, or vice versa if you want to look at it that way. Calves are subject to the full range of and sound pressure levels of song vocalizations. And then mothers and calves make infrequent and generally low frequency calls. Okay, so some of the future work I'd like to do, well, there's still a lot to discover. One thing I want to do is look at the receive levels of social sounds on the tags to get an idea of what source levels these calls are. We generally think of them as lower amplitude, but I'd have to make the measurements to be sure. And then I want to link non-song vocalizations with movement and behavior. So we're trying to do that right now, linking when the calls are being made to dive behavior and movement patterns. So is there a specific movement, like do they make a body turn when they're making a certain sound, or are they always coming up to the surface or diving back down when they make a certain sound? So we're working on correlating behavior observations with these sounds, the non-sound localizations. And then we also want to look at anthropogenic noise effects on these social sounds. We were able to deploy a hydrophone array and record some of the sounds of local whale watching boats. And then we also picked up some boat engine sounds on the tags themselves. So we'd like to look at not only frequencies of the boat noises, but also what sound amplitudes, what sound pressure levels those are. Okay, so I just want to thank all the many people and many funding sources. Couldn't have done any of this work without them. And also especially the administrative staff at HIMB and the zoology program. They were very helpful for all the trips I had to take. Of course, I have to give a special thank you to the folks out at the National Marine Sanctuary. We were able to go out tagging with them. They lent us time and support using their boat to go out there and tag. And of course, all their expertise as well, working with the whales over many years. I have to thank my lab members and all the volunteers that helped out with all the field work. And Bill Burgess, who made the Akusan tag. There were times when I was calling him late at night saying, I need help, there's a problem with the tag. What do I do? And of course I have to thank my committee members, my advisor Whit, has been a great mentor over the past 7 years, and been really encouraging and great at pushing me outside my comfort zone, like asking hard questions. It's really made me a better scientist, so thank you. And I also have to thank Adam because I learned a lot about humpback whales over the past few years working with you in the field. And also all the tagging work wouldn't have been possible without your support, so thank you. And of course my family, my parents couldn't be here in person today, but they're here via live stream, so it's great to have them seeing the work I've been doing. And my sister is here today, so thank you. It's been great to have their encouragement over the years. And of course, my many friends that I've made over the past few years. I'm sure I didn't manage to cover all of you on these pictures, but thank you. You've been a great support system. So, any questions?
What we're going to do now is we're going to have questions from the audience, and after that, we're going to ask the audience to leave and the committee will stay with Jessica and ask more questions. So I just want to open the period where the audience can bring forth their questions.
Yes.
Could you relate that, say, 120 decibels related to 1 micropascal to the human reference standard?
I could do some calculations, but I don't really know off the top of my head.
10 to 20? Just a guess.
So, let's see.
It's kind of hard, Josh, because I look at it and I'm thinking, geez, there's 24 dB difference in dB.
Yeah.
Ask her some other time.
If you give me some time, I'll try and do some calculations.
It's loud. Okay, it's loud.
I have a question. Jessica, you showed that plot and you had day versus night differences with your GAMs at the different locations, and you said southeast you saw a different relationship, where you saw during the daytime it was slightly lower. Could you maybe hypothesize why you think that's the case, or what you think might be going on?
So there wasn't a significant difference between day and night, but if you look at it over the course of the day, it looked like there was a little bit of a peak right around sunrise and another little peak during sunset. That ear was right outside of novaeangliae Harbor, and so my hypothesis is that it's so close to the harbor, there are probably less whales over there, and the sounds that we're picking up are most likely from the boats, the fishing boats that leave the harbor in the morning and come back in the evening.
You know, one of the challenges that has occurred in the humpback whale sort of sound community is being able to define song units or different vocalization units, because different folks end up with different names for things or you know, descriptions. And so I was wondering, first of all, if you intend to, now that you've identified a number of units, both when you were working on song, but especially when you're working on your social sound, do you have sufficient sample sizes, and you think that they would boil down to a series of summary statistics that you could provide for those, so that they could be comparable to, say, some of the samples or definitions that people like Mike Node's group and Rebecca Dunlop have done, and then some of the other folks on the East Coast and stuff, because presumably they're comparable, or there may be some significant overlap. It'd be nice to be able to derive that from looking at what you've gotten and what they've put in the literature.
Yes, so I've been talking to them about that, and we're trying to create a social sound catalog. I've also recently gotten a hold of a program that might be able to pull out more characteristics. So not only just the frequency, like the minimum maximum frequency, which is what I looked at, and the duration, but also where most of the energy is within a sound. And where the 95th percentile is for the amount of energy, things like that. And so I am going to try and run all my calls through that to get these other characteristics and hopefully be able to compare it with these other previously described sounds. And I have looked at like the spectrograms that have been published. Some of mine are very similar to some of the ones that have been published already. And so I've been talking to someone to see if I can get clips, samples of their sounds to see how similar they are to each other.
One of the good things we've done is we've had 2 automatic detection discrimination studies, and in both of them we come up with about 21 to 22 units. And Jessica is doing it visually, and she's coming out with about 21 or so units. And so one day we're going to have a kind of a big powwow and say, we're going to call this unit such and such, we're going to call this unit such and such. And eventually kind of like have a more standardized system.
Well, there's a big difference between the ones that are voiced, which tend to be a little easier to measure, and one of the programs called Crack is pretty good at working on that. But then there's those others that tend to have nonlinear elements or kind of chaotic elements or something that may be from something other than a phonic system like phonic or something. So those are really tough to categorize. It'd be nice to get a handle on that.
Any other questions? Part of the problem, I just don't push. Part of the problem is finding funds to do the work.
That's a strong hint.
Most of a lot of Jessica's work is supported by Sea Grant. And also Allison Stemper before. So what we have to do is get other sources of funding, including a collection basket and dark glasses.
Did you ever pull in some of the white-crowned sparrow people, for instance, who have been working on these kinds of things for decades and decades, to find differences in sparrow song? And I know they played with Fourier analysis, all sorts of stuff that I'm not that familiar with.
No, I think I'll let Jessica.
No, I hadn't talked to any of them about their analysis. It might be something I can look at in the future.
Very similar problem.
Yeah, especially if we want to look at probably like finer scale differences.
Brandon?
Given the
high degree of skill it requires to attach a tag to a humpback whale. Are there changes that you might suggest in either the way the tag is constructed or the procedures you use to tag an animal that might help to make that data set easier to expand?
So, we actually have already refined the way that we approach animals to tag. Back when Allison started several years ago, we did a pilot study just to look at how to tag a calf. And it hadn't been done prior to that. So she found that the easiest way for her was to approach using a very small, like an inflatable boat with paddling to a calf that was just circling on the surface, so when they were stationary. But what we found was that it was a little bit easier to get close to the group if a mother and calf group were traveling slowly and near the surface. It seemed to bother them less because we were able to just kind of motor slowly and ease our way in as opposed to just kind of showing up on top of them, I think. So, I'm sure there are further refinements, but that's what we found to work well so far.
Put that in your eye.
I think Brendan hit on a really, really good point, and I just, you've worked really, really hard to do this. And one of the things that marine mammal people get all the time is, hey, your sample size is so small. Like, you talk about exactly how hard it is for people in the room who might not know to approach and tag a whale, because the video you showed made it look pretty easy.
Okay, so I'll say it takes a long time to find the right group. So we approach many groups of whales, and a lot of the time you'll come up and the mom decides, nope, you're too close, and we're still 50 feet away. So then we go, okay, this mom is not going to cooperate with us. Let's go find another more cooperative group. So it takes a lot of time just observing, making sure we aren't disturbing them too much, and just finding the right group that'll let us come in, place a tag on them, and not come in too aggressively, so as to overly disturb them, but also not be so tentative as to never get any tags deployed. So it's a lot of observation and having the experience and patience to learn how these animals operate and what it takes to get in close enough to put a tag on their back.
And then chasing around until it falls off, too.
And that too, and trying not to lose track of them because they spend most of their time underwater.
And the tags cost about $16,000.
Yes, it's a little bit scary when you lose track of one.
Got a question?
Any questions from online?
Oh, one dumb question.
Okay.
Okay.
I couldn't help but wonder if the whales were maybe more freaked out by the hoopla that happened when you got the tag. I wanted to be quiet so I could get it already disturbing them, which of course needs to happen, but then not to freak them out more.
Well, I don't think it's very likely. First of all, sound doesn't transmit very well from air into water, so it's possible they heard some of it, but they're more likely to be disturbed by the engine noise because that's running constantly.
Yeah, about the engine noise, I know that this is beyond the scope of what the world was, but you said that you had both engine noise recorded on tag. I was wondering if you ever got curious and looked at what the tag, what the whale was actually doing when it's exposed to acid.
I didn't go back into the behavioral records to check, but I do remember a little bit as we were tracking the whales. So there were times when the whale was in the vicinity of other boats and it just seemed to keep doing what it was doing. But the boats weren't super close either. So that's something I would have to look further into, but as I remember, the groups would, the groups tended to react to boats that were passing by really fast, but not so much if they were traveling slower. I don't know what speeds they were traveling at, but I do remember at one point a whale shying away from a boat that just sped by.
You know, along that line, it's, you know, from the Navy's behavioral response studies, a lot of what we've been finding, especially with humpbacks, has been that context has everything to do with response to sound. Some of the work that I've done in the past, you know, I'm sure other people have seen this too. When they're feeding, they can be almost bulletproof to sound that is nearby, whereas something more sensitive, potentially mother-calf interactions could be this way, may solicit strong reactions to noise in the areas. But one of the things I have known, and maybe Adam, you can comment on this, is when there are mother and escorts, and particularly other escorts, they can also be kind of ho-hum about what's going on around them. They're much more focused on sexual interactions and potential for copulation, that kind of thing. I don't know, maybe you were seeing this, but that may be part of what would come up in these kind of studies, and mother calves may be a sensitive situation where some of the other sexual behavior going on around it may be insensitive, and that from whale to whale it could differ quite a bit.
That'd be interesting. I think we had one tag where we had a second escort join and then leave while the tag was still on a mom. But I think all the other groups were just mom calf or mom calf escort. But it would be interesting to go back and look at that one and see if there's a difference in the sounds being picked up from that group.
Well, if there's no more questions, I'm going to ask the audience to leave and the committee members remain, and we'll ask Jessica more questions. I want to thank you for